Welcome to a story that challenges assumptions and showcases the power of standing firm for justice. Tonight, we unravel the encounter between a white police officer and a black woman, who happens to be a state prosecutor. Her identity and unshakable resolve flip the script in an extraordinary turn of events you won't want to miss. It was a calm evening in Riverside, a town where quiet streets and gentle night winds seemed to promise a peaceful life. The street lamps cast long shadows, stretching across sidewalks and empty storefronts, adding an air of stillness that wrapped around the neighborhood. On this particular night, Chloe Brooks walked down one of those streets, her steps even and purposeful. She carried a worn leather briefcase, the sort used by professionals with long careers. Chloe was more than a lawyer. She was a state prosecutor, well known in her field for her determination and unwavering belief in justice. By all appearances, she was a woman who belonged exactly where she was: confident, profesional, and accomplished. Chloe had spent a long day at the district attorney's office, handling cases that weighed heavily on the soul. The types of cases where justice seemed as distant as the stars, but where she fought, nonetheless, for those who could not defend themselves. She was looking forward to an evening with friends, an opportunity to release the stress that followed her home every night. Her friends always joked that she was married to her work, a claim she would brush off with a chuckle, though deep down, she knew it held a bit of truth. Tonight, Chloe wasn't thinking about work or the endless debates about right and wrong. She was thinking about laughter, the kind that took away the strain of the courtroom. But as she approached the corner of the street, her thoughts were interrupted by the flash of blue lights. The quiet hum of a patrol car turned louder, more present. As it drew nearer, Chloe glanced to her side and saw a police car idling just a few feet away. Her steps slowed, and she felt the air shift, heavy with an odd anticipation she couldn't quite place. Behind the wheel sat Sergeant John Carter, a man whose presence was as imposing as his reputation. In Riverside, Carter was known for his thoroughness, though that was perhaps a generous way of describing his suspicion of nearly everyone he met, especially those he deemed out of place. Tonight, his gaze fell on Chloe, a well-dressed black woman walking alone in a neighborhood that, to his mind, didn't quite fit her. Carter had spent years on the force. He had joined with visions of heroism, of protecting the vulnerable. Yet over time, his ideals had hardened into cynicism. His vigilance had morphed into suspicion, especially when it came to certain people in certain neighborhoods. Chloe noticed the way his eyes followed her, measuring, assessing. His patrol lights flickered on, casting a harsh, blue glow over the street. Carter stepped out, his face set with an unreadable expression. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet night. Chloe's steps halted, her heartbeat quickened, a feeling familiar, yet deeply unsettling. "Yes, officer," she replied, keeping her voice steady. She looked him straight in the eye, calm but alert, feeling the weight of his stare. She knew this scene all too well. The questions, the doubting glances, the assumptions, all of it wrapped in an air of forced politeness. "Can I see some identification?" Carter asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Chloe felt a flicker of irritation. She had done nothing wrong. She was just a woman walking in her town, a professional on her way to meet friends. "Is there a problem, officer?" Chloe's voice was calm, carrying a polite edge. But Carter's gaze didn't soften. He was looking for something, some sign that she didn't belong. And Chloe felt the weight of his scrutiny pressing down on her. "It's late," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You look like you don't belong here." His words cut through the night, sharp and unambiguous. Chloe swallowed, keeping her face composed, though a current of anger rippled beneath the surface. With steady hands, she reached for her ID, handing it to him with a composure she'd mastered through years of courtroom battles. She met his gaze, searching for any flicker of recognition, a sign that he understood who she was and would ease off. But instead, Carter's face remained impassive. Skepticism etched in his expression as he glanced at her ID with dismissive detachment. Carter barely glanced at Chloe's ID, his eyes flickering back to her with a hint of doubt that went beyond mere formality. He handed it back, his face a mask of suspicion, as though he were waiting for her to reveal something incriminating. "State Prosecutor." "Ah," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. Chloe knew that tone all too well. A tone that didn't recognize titles or roles, but reduced her to the mere assumptions he'd made the moment he saw her. "Yes, officer. I work at the district attorney's office. I'm on my way to meet friends for dinner," Chloe replied, her voice firm but polite, hoping her words would bring some clarity to the situation. She could feel a tension building, though, an invisible line drawn between them. To her, this was simply an intrusion into her evening. To him, it seemed like a test he was intent on failing her. "Meeting friends, you say?" Carter's tone was sharp, his eyes scanning her, as though she was still hiding something. The street around them remained silent, the quiet broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the low murmur of passers-by, who watched the scene with hesitant glances, unsure whether to intervene or move along. "Look," Chloe continued, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've done nothing wrong. I've given you my ID. I'm simply trying to get where I'm going." But Carter wasn't listening. His hand hovered over his belt, close to his radio, ready to escalate the situation at a moment's notice. Chloe felt her patience wearing thin, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her like a heavy shroud. She wasn't just being questioned, she was being judged, scrutinized in a way that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with her appearance. "Fine," Carter finally said, a gruff edge to his voice. "But if you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind letting me take a look in your bag." His eyes dropped to her briefcase, and Chloe felt a surge of indignation rise within her. She had given him what he'd asked for, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. "No, officer," she replied, her voice firm now, a spark of defiance lighting her gaze. "I know my rights, and you have no probable cause to search my belongings." They stood in silence, locked in a silent standoff. Chloe could feel the weight of his suspicion, his unwillingness to back down. She had faced tough battles in the courtroom, but this felt different, more personal, more direct. She knew that one wrong word could shift the balance, could turn a tense exchange into something far more serious. In the distance, a second patrol car approached, its headlights slicing through the evening shadows. Chloe felt a glimmer of relief, a faint hope that someone else might see this for what it was. As the car pulled up, the tension in the air grew sharper, a scene unfolding that neither of them could control or predict. As the night pressed on, Chloe felt the lingering tension settle around her like an uncomfortable weight. Carter's glare was still imprinted in her mind, his hostility refusing to fade even as he walked away. She watched him retreat, knowing that while she had stood her ground, this confrontation had left a mark, not only on her, but on every assumption and prejudice she had fought against in her career. She took a deep breath, willing herself to shake off the unease and continue toward the restaurant. Her friends would be waiting, probably wondering where she was by now. Yet as she walked, each step forward felt heavier, weighed down by the encounter she couldn't just leave behind. She thought back to her days in law school, to the professors who had drilled into her the importance of upholding justice with dignity, of challenging bias with unwavering resolve. Those lessons had been ingrained deeply, as had her conviction that the law could be a tool for positive change. But here, on the quiet streets of Riverside, the reality was far messier. The ideals she believed in so strongly had clashed directly with the embedded biases that refused to see past her skin color. As she rounded the corner toward the restaurant, the warm glow from within reached out to her, a contrast to the coldness that lingered from her exchange with Carter. She stopped, glancing inside, and saw her friends seated at a table in the back, laughing over shared stories and drinks. The scene felt almost surreal now, a world apart from the turmoil she had just experienced. A part of her wanted to walk in, to sit down and let the evening meld away into the familiar comforts of laughter and friendship. But another part of her, the part that was still reeling from the encounter, knew she couldn't just brush it aside. She couldn't pretend that the evening hadn't taken this turn, that her mere presence on a riverside street hadn't raised doubts about her belonging. Just as she was about to make a decision, her phone buzzed in her purse. She glanced at the screen. It was Jay, her colleague from the district attorney's office. He was someone who had been there since the beginning of her career. Someone who understood the challenges she faced not only as a prosecutor, but as a black woman navigating a justice system that didn't always live up to its name. Chloe hesitated, then answered. "Jay, I heard what happened," he said without preamble, his voice tinged with concern. "Are you okay?" Chloe paused, unsure of how to respond. Was she okay? She had faced hostility in courtrooms, dealt with the biases of opposing counsel, even handled cases that kept her awake at night. But this felt different. She was tired, not just from the evening's events, but from a lifetime of carrying the weight of assumptions made before she even opened her mouth. "I'm fine," she replied eventually, though the words felt hollow. But it was frustrating. Jay sighed on the other end of the line. "John only imagine. Carter's got a reputation. You know, it's not the first time something like this has happened, but it doesn't make it any easier." Chloe let out a slow breath. She wanted to leave it behind her, to focus on her evening with friends. Yet she knew that this wasn't something she could ignore. This wasn't just about tonight. It was about a system that allowed people like Carter to act on their biases without consequence. About a society that still judged her by her appearance before considering her achievements. "I don't think I can just let this go, Jay," she said, her voice steady but resolute. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who's been made to feel like they don't belong, like they're guilty of something just for existing." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Jay spoke, his tone supportive. "I get it, Chloe. If you want to take this further, I'm here. You know that." Chloe closed her eyes, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. "Thanks, Jay. You think you need it?" She hung up, looking back at the restaurant one last time. Tonight wasn't the night to join them, not with this still so fresh in her mind. Instead, she turned and walked back toward her apartment, her steps purposeful. She knew now that her path wasn't just about pursuing justice in the courtroom. This was personal, and she was prepared to face it head on. The next morning, sunlight crept through the blinds in Chloe's apartment, casting faint shadows across the room. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the encounter with Carter over and over. She felt the familiar weight of frustration settle in her chest. But this time, it was mingled with a newfound determination. She had spent years in the legal field, fighting for fairness and justice. And yet here she was, a prosecutor, treated like a suspect in her own neighborhood. After a quick shower and a cup of coffee, Chloe made her way to the district attorney's office, her steps firm with purpose. She had arranged to meet Jay in the lobby before filing her complaint. As she approached the building, she felt a surge of resolve. This was about more than just her own experience. It was about challenging the assumptions and biases that had no place in law enforcement. Jay was already waiting when she arrived, his face serious but supportive. He gave her a nod, and together they walked to the office of Melanie Harper, an assistant district attorney known for her commitment to holding officers accountable in cases of misconduct. Chloe and Melanie had worked on several cases together in the past. But today, Chloe was here in a new role, not as a prosecutor, but as someone seeking justice for herself. "Chloe." Melanie greeted her with a tight smile, gesturing for her to sit. She glanced over at Jay, then back at Chloe, her expression somber. "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry you had to go through that." Chloe nodded, though the sympathy, while appreciated, did little to ease her frustration. "Thank you, Melanie. But I'm here because something needs to be done about it. This isn't just a misunderstanding, it's a problem." Melanie sighed and opened a file folder. "I understand. I've already started drafting the complaint based on what Jay told me. We'll need a detailed statement from you, and then we can submit it to Internal Affairs for investigation." The mention of Internal Affairs made Chloe's stomach sink slightly. She knew all too well how these investigations often went. Officers rarely faced serious consequences, and the system was structured to protect its own. But she also knew she couldn't just walk away from this. She had to believe that this time might be different. "Let's get started," Chloe said, her voice steady. She began to recount the events of the previous night in precise detail, each word carefully chosen. She described Carter's suspicion, his accusations, the way he dismissed her credentials as if they meant nothing. She spoke of the assumptions he had made, assumptions that led him to see her not as a professional, but as a threat. Melanie took notes as Chloe spoke, nodding occasionally, her expression growing more serious with each detail. By the time Chloe finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Jay placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, offering silent support as Melanie reviewed her notes. "This is a strong case, Chloe," Melanie said finally. "But I won't lie to you. Carter's been with the force for years, and he has connections. The police union will likely get involved, and they'll do everything they can to downplay this or shift the blame onto you." Chloe's jaw tightened. She had expected as much, but hearing it aloud was sobering. "I'm prepared for that. I know this won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do." Melanie's expression softened. "We'll fight this, and I'll be with you every step of the way." The complaint was officially filed, and as Chloe left the office with Jay by her side, she felt a sense of accomplishment. She knew this was only the beginning, but it was a beginning that mattered. Over the next few days, Chloe's life became a whirlwind of statements, interviews, and endless paperwork. Word of her complaint against Sergeant Carter spread quickly, and soon her name appeared in local news reports, accompanied by headlines that seemed to stir both support and controversy. Some articles praised her for standing up to what they called an abuse of authority, while others hinted that she was looking for publicity, trying to use the incident to further her career. As Chloe sat in her office, scrolling through one of these articles, her phone buzzed. It was Melanie. "Chloe, we got a problem." Melanie's voice was tense. "The police union is going public with a statement tomorrow. They're accusing you of being uncooperative during the encounter and of escalating the situation. They're framing it like you're the one who caused the confrontation." Chloe closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she processed this new twist. She had known the union would stand by Carter, but to turn the tables so completely, to make her look like the aggressor, was a low she hadn't anticipated. "Let them," she replied, her voice steady. "I know the truth, and I'm not backing down." The next morning, Chloe watched as the local news covered the union statement. The union spokesperson, a veteran officer with years of public relations experience, spoke in a calm, authoritative voice, carefully choosing words that painted Carter as an officer simply doing his duty. "We take all accusations of misconduct seriously," he said, staring directly into the camera. "But it's important to remember that our officers often have to make split-second decisions in difficult situations. Sergeant Carter, a respected member of the force for over 15 years, was following protocol that night in Riverside. His only concern was the safety of the community." Chloe could feel her frustration mounting as she listened. The spokesperson continued, implying that Chloe had acted unusual and had refused to cooperate, which they claimed had led to the escalation. The message was clear. They were painting her as the problem. When the broadcast ended, Chloe sat in silence, feeling the familiar weight of injustice pressing down on her. This was precisely what she had feared, a system closing ranks, twisting the narrative until the victim became the villain. But she wasn't about to let them control the story. She spent the next few hours drafting a public statement of her own. Each word was chosen carefully, each sentence crafted to convey the truth without an ounce of exaggeration. By evening, her statement was released to the press. "As a state prosecutor, I have dedicated my career to upholding justice and ensuring that all people, regardless of race, gender, or background, are treated fairly under the law. The events of that night were a clear abuse of power, and I will not allow the truth to be distorted. I complied with the officer's requests and was treated with suspicion simply because of the color of my skin. This is not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger pattern of bias and injustice that too many people in our community face every day. I stand by my actions, and I will continue to fight for justice." not just for myself, but for everyone who has been wrongfully targeted by those who misuse their authority." The statement struck a chord. By the next morning, her phone was flooded with messages. Activist groups, fellow prosecutors, community leaders, they were all reaching out, offering their support. Chloe could feel a movement building around her, a groundswell of voices echoing her own frustration, amplifying her story. But she knew the fight was far from over. The union was determined to protect Carter, and the backlash was fierce. Every day seemed to bring a new article or comment casting doubt on her integrity, questioning her motives. Public scrutiny was relentless, and as each day passed, the emotional toll began to weigh on her. She was fighting for justice, but it was a fight that came with consequences. In the quiet of her apartment that evening, Chloe took a deep breath, grounding herself. She had expected this challenge, anticipated the backlash, and yet the weight of it all felt overwhelming. But she reminded herself of her purpose. This wasn't just about her. It was about demanding accountability from a system that needed to change. And she wasn't alone in this. As she glanced at her phone, she saw countless messages of support, each one a reminder that she was part of something much larger. This battle was only beginning, and Chloe Brooks was ready for whatever came next. Days turned into weeks, and Chloe's life took on a new rhythm, one marked by constant media attention, interviews, and meetings with her legal team. The public battle was draining, but it was nothing compared to the personal toll the fight was taking. Every time she saw Carter's face on the news, every time she heard another baseless accusation against her, a deep sense of injustice gnawed at her. The media was turning her into a symbol of resistance, but it also made her an easy target for the very system she was fighting to reform. The investigation into Carter's actions dragged on, and Chloe felt as though she was caught in a storm of her own making. She was torn between the need to keep pushing forward and the overwhelming exhaustion that threatened to swallow her whole. But she couldn't stop, not now, not when the stakes were so high. One afternoon, as Chloe walked through the district attorney's office, she caught sight of Jay, who was waiting for her outside her office. His face was serious, his brow furrowed in thought. "Chloe, we need to talk," he said quietly, his voice tense. "About what?" she asked, sensing the shift in his tone. "I just got off the phone with Melanie," he began. "Internal Affairs finished their investigation into Carter, and they've made their findings." Chloe's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she could barely breathe. The tension of the past few weeks had led her to this moment, the possibility that the system would hold Carter accountable. But there was always doubt, always fear that it would be swept under the rug, just like so many other cases before it. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jay looked at her, his expression both solemn and hopeful. "They found him guilty of misconduct. They're recommending disciplinary action. He's been suspended pending further review." Chloe stood there, frozen. The weight of the moment settled over her, and she felt a flood of emotions rush in: relief, vindication, and most of all, a sense of pride. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't even about Carter. It was about every person who had ever been wronged, every individual whose voice had been silenced by a system that refused to acknowledge their humanity. For the first time in weeks, Chloe allowed herself a moment of peace. But she knew that the fight wasn't over. The suspension was only the beginning, and the road ahead would be long. The police union would undoubtedly fight back, and they would use every resource they had to protect their own. But for now, Chloe allowed herself to feel something she hadn't allowed in a long time: hope. She spent the next few days reflecting on everything that had brought her to this point, the challenges she had faced, the prejudice she had fought against, and the weight of the responsibility she carried. This was more than a legal battle. This was a personal fight, one she could not afford to lose. As Chloe stood before the press, preparing to address the media about the findings of the Internal Affairs investigation, she felt a deep sense of purpose settle in her chest. She was no longer just a prosecutor. She was a voice for those who had been ignored for far too long. And she wasn't backing down. The press conference was a turning point. Chloe stood tall, her voice steady and clear as she spoke to the gathered reporters. "This victory isn't just mine," she began. This is a victory for everyone who has been unjustly targeted, for everyone who has been forced to fight against biases they didn't ask for, simply because of how they look. Today, we've taken one step forward in holding those in power accountable. But the fight is far from over. I won't stop until we have true justice for all. Her words resonated far beyond the walls of the press room, spreading across the news and social media. Chloe felt the swell of support from the public, but she also felt the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a change that had been too long in coming. As the days passed, the scrutiny intensified. Chloe's personal life was increasingly in the public eye, and with it came a renewed wave of criticism. Some hailed her as a hero, while others questioned her motives, accusing her of grandstanding for publicity. The media storm raged on, but Chloe refused to let it define her. Each day, she reminded herself that this wasn't just about the headlines. It wasn't about the media attention or the public scrutiny. It was about making sure that what happened to her didn't happen to others. It was about standing up, not just for herself, but for a system that desperately needed change. She had stood her ground when it mattered most, and she would continue to do so, no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be. The weeks after the press conference passed in a blur of mixed emotions. The weight of victory was bittersweet, tempered by the constant pushback from the police union and a media landscape that seemed eager to tear her down. Chloe's name was still plastered across headlines. But now, they were divided. Some painted her as a trailblazer, a fierce advocate for justice, while others derided her as a troublemaker seeking attention. The polarized opinions were exhausting, but she knew better than to let them deter her. It wasn't just her reputation at stake now. It was the message she was sending to the system, a message that no one, no matter their position, was above the law. But even as she stood firm, Chloe could feel the personal toll growing heavier with each passing day. The constant media presence, the anonymous threats, the whispers from colleagues, it all took its toll. Some days, the weight of it all felt unbearable. But Chloe wasn't one to give up. Not after all she had endured. She had her moments of doubt. Of course, moments when she wondered if she was doing the right thing. But then she thought about the people who reached out to her. The countless messages of support from people who had felt powerless for too long. She thought about the faces of the people she had fought for in the courtroom. The faces of those who had never had the opportunity to fight back. One afternoon, as she sat in her office, Chloe's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Melanie. The familiar tone in Melanie's voice signaled that something important had happened. "Chloe, we got the results of the internal investigation," Melanie said, her voice laced with both relief and caution. "They've recommended further disciplinary action against Sergeant Carter." Chloe leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly as the weight of the moment sank in. This was the moment she had worked so hard for, the moment when the system had finally started to acknowledge what had happened. Carter wasn't just facing a slap on the wrist. He was facing real consequences. "What's next?" Chloe asked, her voice steady, despite the rush of emotions she felt. Melanie paused for a moment before replying. "We need to make sure this doesn't get buried. The public support we've received is enormous. But Carter still has powerful allies. We have to push to make sure this is more than just a suspension. We need to see real accountability." Chloe felt her pulse quicken. She knew the system well enough to understand that the fight was never truly over. Even after a win, it would take continued pressure, continued vigilance, to ensure that Carter's actions didn't go unpunished. "I'm ready," Chloe said with quiet determination. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been treated this way." With the internal investigation findings in hand, Chloe and her legal team pushed forward, working tirelessly to ensure that Carter's suspension wasn't just temporary. The pressure mounted as both the media and the public began demanding answers. It wasn't long before the local government had no choice but to act. The investigation, fueled by the unwavering determination of Chloe and her team, reached a point where the police force had to make a final decision. Disciplinary measures would be enforced. As the days turned into weeks, Chloe's public statements continued to advocate for change. She was unyielding in her call for accountability. reminding the public that this wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. It was about the systemic issues that allowed that misconduct to persist. The news of Carter's suspension sent shockwaves through the community, and it wasn't long before conversations began to shift. People who had previously stayed silent about police bias and abuse of power started to speak out, sharing their own experiences. The ripple effect of Chloe's stand against Carter's actions began to resonate far beyond Riverside. But even as she celebrated small victories, Chloe knew the fight was far from over. She had won a battle, but the war against systemic injustice was ongoing. With Carter's future still uncertain, Chloe continued to prepare for the next step. In those quiet moments, when the news was slow and the headlines settled, Chloe allowed herself to reflect on the journey. She had never imagined that a simple walk home would lead her to this moment where her fight had sparked something much bigger than herself. She wasn't just standing up for her rights anymore. She was standing up for an entire community that had long been silenced. As she prepared for the next phase of the battle, Chloe knew one thing for certain: she wasn't finished yet. The system might have been shaken, but it wasn't broken. Not yet. And Chloe was going to be there every step of the way, making sure the change she had started would continue, no matter the cost. In the weeks after Chloe's public statement, the pressure surrounding the case only intensified. While the public support for her continued to grow, the police union fought hard to protect Sergeant Carter. They worked tirelessly to downplay his actions, framing him as a man simply doing his job. The media coverage became increasingly polarized. Some outlets hailed Chloe as a hero, while others questioned her motives and painted her as a troublemaker. But Chloe didn't let the criticism deter her. The battle for justice was far from over, and she was more determined than ever. Then came the day of the crucial hearing. Chloe was once again summoned to give her testimony to Internal Affairs. This time, however, the stakes felt even higher. She sat in a room filled with investigators, legal representatives, and union members, all scrutinizing her every word. Chloe knew this hearing could determine whether Sergeant Carter would face real consequences or walk away with little more than a slap on the wrist. As the questioning began, Chloe remained composed, recounting the events of that night with clarity and precision. She spoke not only about what had happened to her, but about the larger issue of systemic bias within law enforcement. The room was tense, and Chloe could feel the weight of every word she said. Despite attempts by the union's representatives to undermine her credibility, casting doubts on her version of events, Chloe held her ground. Hours passed, and finally, the hearing concluded. Chloe walked out of the room feeling a mix of exhaustion and quiet hope. She knew the battle wasn't over. There were still more decisions to be made, and the road ahead would be long. But in that moment, she felt a sense of purpose and strength. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was wait. A few days later, Chloe received the news she had been waiting for. Internal Affairs had completed their investigation, and the findings were clear. Sergeant Carter had been found guilty of misconduct. The recommendation was for further disciplinary action, including suspension and potential dismissal. For the first time in this fight, Chloe felt a sense of victory. The system had taken a step toward holding Carter accountable, and that was something she had fought for every day since the night she was stopped on that quiet street. However, Chloe knew this was just one victory in a much larger battle. While the suspension was a significant step, it was not the end. She would continue to fight for real, lasting change that would ensure justice for everyone, not just for herself. There were still many forces working to protect officers like Carter, but Chloe was ready for whatever came next. As the news of Carter's suspension and potential dismissal spread, Chloe reflected on everything she had fought for: the rights of the oppressed, the accountability of law enforcement, and the recognition of systemic bias. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been unjustly targeted because of their appearance, their race, or their background. Chloe wasn't finished yet. She knew that the fight for justice would continue, and she would be at the forefront of it. This was only the beginning, and she would not back down. Chloe's victory over Sergeant Carter was just the beginning. Though the system had taken a step toward accountability, she knew there was still much to be done. The battle for justice was ongoing, but Chloe was more determined than ever. With her victory, the momentum for change was undeniable. As she continued her fight for systemic reform, Chloe knew the road would be long and filled with challenges. But the support from her community and the changes already set in motion fueled her resolve. Chloe had proven that one voice, one stand, could make a difference, and she was ready to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for all those who had been wronged. This was only the beginning. Chloe Brooks was not backing down. Thank you for watching and joining us in this powerful journey of courage and justice. Chloe Brooks' story reminds us that standing up against bias and systemic injustice can spark meaningful change, no matter the challenges. We hope her resilience inspires you to confront inequality and advocate for fairness in your own life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more impactful stories that shine a light on the fight for justice and equality.